The drive to the town was longer than I had expected. Miles of empty highway stretched ahead, flanked by dense forests on both sides. My GPS had gone haywire an hour ago, so I had to rely on an old printed map I found in my glove compartment. It was strange navigating this way again, but it added a sense of adventure to the trip. I needed this. A break from the chaos of city life, from the endless noise and demands. When I finally reached the town, it looked almost too picturesque to be real. Quaint wooden houses with slanted roofs lined cobblestone streets. There were colorful flower boxes in every window, and the air smelled like pine and freshly baked bread. The kind of place that would have been on the cover of a travel magazine 20 years ago. But something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence. The town seemed too quiet, even for a remote spot like this. A couple of people glanced in my direction as I drove past, but they quickly looked away, as if they didn't want to be caught staring. Others shuffled along the streets, heads down, moving with an odd, deliberate pace. I pulled up in front of the only inn I could find, a small rustic building with a sign that read, Willow Creek Lodge. Inside, the owner greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're here for the weekend?" he asked, his voice steady but distant. "Yeah," I replied, setting my bag down on the counter. Needed some peace and quiet. This place looked perfect. He hesitated before handing me the key to my room, as if debating whether to say something. "It's a peaceful town," he said finally, "but there are some rules you'll need to follow while you're here." "Rules?" I laughed. "What kind of rules?" The man pulled a folded piece of paper from beneath the counter and slid it toward me. The list was handwritten, and the edges of the paper were worn, as if it had been handled too many times. "Don't stay outside after 11 p.m. Always help someone if they ask you for assistance. Ignore any strange sounds or screams you hear at night." I stared at the paper, waiting for the punchline. But the owner's face was as serious as a funeral. "You're not joking," I said, more to myself than to him. "No, sir," he replied. "We take these rules very seriously here. For your own safety, I suggest you do the same." Something about the way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. But I didn't argue. I tucked the list into my pocket, grabbed my key, and headed up to my room. The room itself was modest but cozy, a small bed with a quilted cover, a writing desk by the window, and a view of the town square below. I sat by the window for a while, watching, as the last few townsfolk hurried indoors. By the time the old clock tower struck 11, the streets were completely empty. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt magnified in the silence. Around midnight, I thought I heard something, a faint, distant scream. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. But then I remembered the rules. I woke up the next morning to a pale gray light filtering through the curtains. It must have rained overnight, as the streets glistened with moisture, giving the town an even more surreal appearance. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee from the inn's tiny kitchen, I decided to explore. Stepping outside, I noticed the same uneasy quiet I'd felt the day before. It wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the way people moved. The locals went about their routines with an unsettling precision. Their gazes were always downcast, and if they spoke to one another, it was in hushed tones that I couldn't make out. I stopped at a small bakery near the town square, drawn in by the smell of freshly baked bread. The woman behind the counter looked to be in her 50s, with deep lines etched into her face and eyes that darted nervously as she wrapped up my order. "First time here?" she asked, her voice strained. "Yeah," I said, taking the bag she handed me. "It's a beautiful town, Quiet, though. She nodded quickly, avoiding my gaze. Quiet is good. It's safe. Before I could ask her what she meant, the door opened behind me, and a man stepped in. She stiffened immediately, her demeanor shifting to something closer to fear. I turned to see a wiry, pale man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His sunken eyes met mine for a brief second before he brushed past me and muttered something to the baker. She handed him a loaf of bread without saying a word. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it left me uneasy. As I wandered through the town, that sense of unease only deepened. There were no children playing in the streets, no dogs barking, no casual chatter between neighbors. Everyone seemed to have somewhere urgent to be, but no one moved with the kind of energy or purpose you'd expect. It was as if they were all just going through the motions. By mid-afternoon, I found myself sitting on a bench near the clock tower, watching the sparse foot traffic. That's when I noticed another outsider. He was sitting on the bench opposite mine, wearing a faded baseball cap and an oversized coat. He looked like a tourist, a little out of place like me. But there was something odd about him too. His leg bounced nervously, and he kept glancing around as if expecting someone, or something. I decided to strike up a conversation. "First time here?" I asked, echoing the baker's words from earlier. He flinched at my voice but managed a weak smile. "Second," he said, "but I don't think I'll be staying long this time." "Why not?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the clock tower behind me. "Let's just say I didn't follow the rules last night." I wanted to press him for details, but before I could, he stood abruptly. "Take my advice," he said, his voice low. "Stick to the rules. All of them. No exceptions." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. I couldn't get that man's warning out of my head. It played on a loop as I walked back to the inn. What had he meant by no exceptions? What had happened to him for breaking the rules? Back in my room, I stared at the paper the innkeeper had given me. The rules seemed harmless on the surface, eccentric maybe, but hardly sinister. Yet the way everyone spoke about them, the tension in their voices, suggested something much darker. By the time evening rolled around, my curiosity was clawing at me. I decided to take a short walk to clear my head. I'd stick close to the inn, just enough to stretch my legs before calling it a night. The air outside was colder than I expected, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. The streets were already empty, though the clock in the square hadn't yet struck 11. I told myself I'd be back before then. Just a few minutes. I wandered aimlessly, letting the quiet envelop me. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the distant rustle of tree branches. But as I turned down a narrow side street, something caught my attention. A figure was standing at the end of the road, just barely visible in the dim light of a single street lamp. It was a man, hunched over, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his gaze on me. I froze, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to turn around and walk the other way, but something stopped me. He didn't look threatening, just out of place. "Hey," I called out. "You okay?" He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if confused by my question. I took a cautious step forward. "Do you need help?" That's when the clock struck 11. The sound of the bells reverberated through the air, deep and ominous. As the final chime faded, the man moved. But it wasn't a normal movement. It was sudden, jerky, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. He started walking toward me. "Listen, man, I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't stop. His steps were uneven, almost unnatural, and his face was still obscured by shadow. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally turned and ran, I could hear his footsteps behind me, quick, erratic, gaining on me. I made it back to the inn, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, everything was silent, and I dared to hope that I'd lost him. But then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there, just the curtains swaying slightly, as if disturbed by a breeze. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old building, sent my mind racing. When the sun finally rose, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words, scrawled in jagged handwriting. You were warned. Leave. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as the morning light spilled over the town, chasing away the shadows of the night, the warning in that note echoed in my mind. You were warned. Leave. But I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. There were too many unanswered questions. I needed to know what was happening in this town. At breakfast, the innkeeper avoided eye contact with me. When I pressed him about the note, he stiffened and shook his head. You shouldn't have been outside after 11, he said, his voice low. You don't want to know what happens if you break the rules again. Why not just tell me? I demanded. What's the big secret? What's going on here? He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something about needing to tend to the kitchen and disappeared through a side door. Frustrated, I decided to take matters into my own hands. If no one was going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I spent the morning walking through the town, stopping at every shop and corner store, hoping someone would be willing to talk. Most people ignored me or offered vague platitudes about how quiet is good and rules keep us safe. But as the day wore on, I finally found someone who seemed willing to open up. A man in his 70s, sitting on a bench near the town square. Looking for trouble, son? He asked, his voice raspy from years of smoking. Just answers, I said, sitting down beside him. What's with the rules? Why is everyone so scared? The old man lit a cigarette and took a long drag before speaking. This town's been here a long time, he began. Longer than it should have been, if you ask me. Back in the 1800s, there was a famine. Crops failed, livestock died, people were starving. They say the townsfolk made a deal with something. What kind of deal? I asked, leaning forward. He exhaled a plume of smoke and shook his head. Don't know all the details, but the rules keep it in check, keeps us safe. Break 'em, and it wakes up. It? I pressed. What's it? The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood and flicked his cigarette to the ground. If you've got any sense, you'll leave before it notices you again. His cryptic warning only fueled my determination. I headed to the library, hoping to find something, anything, that could shed light on what was going on. The building was old and musty, with shelves crammed full of faded books and yellowed newspapers. After an hour of searching, I stumbled upon a journal tucked away in the archives. It belonged to someone named Henry Calloway, a town resident from the late 19th century. The entries started off mundane, detailing the struggles of daily life during the famine. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Henry wrote about a ritual performed by the townsfolk, something to bring prosperity back to the land. He described strange lights in the sky, whispers in the wind, and an overwhelming sense of dread. The final entry was the most chilling. We have what we asked for, but at what cost? The rules are all that keep it at bay. May God forgive us. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That night, as I returned to the inn, I couldn't stop replaying the journal's words in my head. The rules weren't just a precaution, they were a necessity, and I'd already broken one. As I approached my room, I heard a faint noise behind me. Turning, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was the man I'd seen on the street the night before, the one who'd moved like a puppet. His head tilted unnaturally, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But the second rule flashed through my mind. Always help someone if they ask you for assistance. Before I could react, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. When they came back on, the figure was gone. I barely slept that night. The image of the glassy-eyed man haunted me every time I closed my eyes. His voice, strained, desperate, echoed in my head. Help me. I had ignored him, and now I couldn't stop wondering what might happen next. By morning, the weight of my mistakes was unbearable. I had broken 2 of the rules, staying out past 11 and failing to help someone who asked. The tension in the air was palpable, like the whole town was holding its breath. I decided to leave. The warnings, the cryptic stories, the eerie encounters. It was too much. I packed my bag and went downstairs ready to check out. The innkeeper was waiting for me at the front desk, his face pale and drawn. "You can't leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Watch me," I snapped. He didn't argue. Instead, he slid a piece of paper across the counter, the same list of rules he'd given me when I first arrived. "You're already in too deep," he said. "Leaving won't fix it. You've been marked." "Marked for what?" I demanded. Before he could answer, the clock tower began to chime. It wasn't the soft, measured toll of the previous nights. It was loud, erratic, almost frantic. The innkeeper's face went white. "It's awake," he whispered. Outside, the town had transformed. The streets were shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog, and shadows darted across the periphery of my vision. The once quiet town square was now filled with a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned to the innkeeper. "What is it? What's happening?" He didn't answer. Instead, he bolted for the back door, leaving me alone. Then I heard the screams. They were coming from the direction of the clock tower. Against every instinct screaming at me to run the other way, I found myself moving toward the sound. As I approached, I saw figures emerging from the fog, locals, but not quite. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, their heads jerking at odd angles. Their eyes were hollow, lifeless, and they were coming straight for me. I ran, darting down alleyways and side streets, but no matter where I turned, they were there, closing in. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eventually, I stumbled into the church at the edge of town, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The inside was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. At the front of the church, beneath a crumbling altar, I saw it. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It was a mass of shadow and flesh, its form constantly shifting, writhing. Eyes, too many to count, blinked in unison, locking onto me. The hum I'd heard earlier was louder now, emanating from the thing as it moved closer. I backed away, tripping over a broken pew, and falling to the ground. My mind raced, searching for anything I could do, but there was nothing. The rules had been broken, and now it wanted me. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was a voice, a whisper, low and guttural. "You didn't listen." When I woke up, the world was different. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and the church was eerily silent. The thing I had seen, the mass of shadow and flesh, was gone, but its presence lingered, etched into the walls and into my mind. My body ached, as if I'd been crushed under a tremendous weight. I stumbled outside, expecting to see the fog, the figures, the horror, but everything looked normal. The sun was shining, the streets were clean, and the town seemed as serene as it had when I'd first arrived. And yet, it wasn't the same. People moved about the square, but they didn't look at me. They didn't look at each other. They went about their business like clockwork, their faces blank, their movements robotic. Even the air carried an unnatural stillness. I tried to speak to someone, anyone, but no one would respond. It was as if I wasn't there, as if I had become a ghost in this strange, haunted town. I returned to the inn to gather my things, though I wasn't sure where I planned to go. My car, parked just where I'd left it, started without issue. The road out of town stretched ahead, endless and empty, but I didn't feel the relief I expected as I drove away. Just before I crossed the town line, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Someone, or something, was sitting in the back seat. Weeks later, a new visitor arrives at the inn. As the innkeeper hands them the key to their room, he offers the same piece of paper I'd been given. But this time, there's something different. A warning scrawled at the bottom, written in trembling handwriting. Don't break the rules. Don't stay. Leave while you can.